Hello everybody, welcome. We're working on the skull today. I'm gonna have a lot of fun. I'm gonna try out some new things with materials today. So if you're following along, you're gonna find the reference image in the description. I've got some vine charcoal, I've got a carbon pencil, and I've got charcoal pencil. I'm gonna see how they interact. The carbon pencil is kind of a blend between graphite and charcoal. And so I'm kind of curious to see what's going to happen. And I've got this relatively smooth paper that's going to allow me to get some of this fine detail in here. So this is going to be a really fun subject. As we get started, I just want to say hi to everybody joining in. We see a lot of familiar faces here, so welcome. Taryn, if you're watching, hello. Britton, Sawyer, you guys watching too? So I see Irene, JC, Betty, Laura, Victoria, Vicky, Jam, welcome, Martha, Mary, a lot of familiar faces. So we're going to get started. I think today I want to use this time to again, practice comparative measuring and controlling proportions. Ultimately, this becomes about subtle value control, this kind of a lot of white on white, and really observing the shape of the shadows is a very complex form. So I think it's going to really test the ability to control proportions. So today I'm going to be using some of the techniques we've been using in a lot of these videos so far, which is, again, comparative measuring, angle sighting, etc. And I'll talk through that. If you're new to this series, I'm going to talk through those as well. Next week, we're going to be working with hair. We're going to be doing some fur and some different textures. And I think it's going to really be ultimately about texture, and I'm going to show you techniques then for kind of transferring proportions if you're really struggling with that. So today, again, it's about transferring those proportions on the page. So I think that's a really valuable skill. If you're using optical devices like a camera lucida, or if you're transferring, or if you're using a grid to control proportions, that's perfectly fine. But I think it's good and healthy to also control proportions using some of these traditional methods. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at some of the audio here, and I see it peaking sometimes, so hopefully it's all right here. So we're going to get started. I've got an image in front of me they're going to be using, and I've got this printout here. And the first thing I want to do is actually take my vine charcoal. This is a really smooth paper, so it's going to really slide around. I want to kind of establish the top and the bottom to make sure it fits on the page. I'm offsetting it a little bit, pushing it off to the right, giving it a little bit of space off to the left. And I really want to be observing the balance between light and dark at some point, but first I want to start by just thinking my way through the subject, looking for the basic angle of the skull. If I were to run a center line right up here, what is that angle? And that just helps me to hold in my mind what that slope is. And start to think through some of the basic forms from there. And one of the things, again, if you've been with us for a while, you'll have heard me say this, but if you're new, at this stage, it's all about just getting marks on the page. We're creating a loose gesture, but nothing here is going to be permanent. I want to get marks on the page just so I have something concrete to evaluate and eventually then kind of adjust. But if I have marks on the page, I can make very clear decisions about what needs to happen to those. So I can, for example, if I'm working with the eye sockets here, if my initial pass is too large or too small, I have something that I can utilize. I can say this needs to be smaller, it needs to be moved over to the right or the left, etc. So that's really what's happening in this initial phase, is just kind of reacting to what's in front of me, thinking, moving back and forth very quickly with my eyes, getting marks on there, and then I'm going to go through and correct them. Not thinking too much about detail at this point, but if I'm kind of happy with the overall kind of placement of this and think, all right, I think in general this is going to be able to fit, then I think I'm in good shape. So these initial marks really light. I'm just using the side of the charcoal. This is a soft vine charcoal. And if at any point throughout the process you have any questions, feel free to shout out in the chat field here. Using all caps helps me to identify questions versus general comments, but I'm going to do my best to try to monitor that as much as possible. I love the little reflection underneath the skull. I'm not going to indicate that quite at this point, but I just kind of thinking about that as I move forward. So this initial phase is a lot about just wrapping my head around it, orienting myself, kind of thinking ahead to what might give me trouble later on, using the side of my hand to kind of smooth out this charcoal. And one of the things we've also talked about in this series a lot is getting rid of the white early on, because the white is so intense that we then calibrate our values to that. Everything is going to feel darker in the context of the white paper than it actually is. And so this gray looks darker because I still have some of the white. But as I build through the drawing, that'll go away. So again, this is all looking like a mess right now, just looking at very large value masses. I dropped my eraser, so I need to pick that. I'm going to need this later on. Let me see. Any questions? Everybody good? All right. Now, multiple passes we take at correcting the proportions, and you're always going to be correcting, always be thinking about correcting proportions as you go along. So, it's not a matter of necessarily drawing a line, sticking to it, and never changing, and just kind of filling in the values. We're always correcting as we go, and so we want to try to build up the whole drawing. So looking back at the initial line that I can start to see through here, I'm going to take another stab. So some of the things I'm thinking about too are what landmarks I want to use to help control the proportions. I think the nose here is going to be helpful because it looks like it's pretty much right in the center of the skull if we measure from top to bottom. And then from there, I can use that as a landmark to evaluate some of these key points like the cheekbones down to the base of the skull. This point here, the back here of the skull where the jawline meets. Those are some key points that'll be helpful. Also, if I run a vertical line up here, I can see how it bisects this eye socket and cuts up through the forehead. The crown of the head is really offset to the right, and that's really kind of in the middle of the drawing in general. So the distance between these two, if we split that in half, we see the top of the head here, and it runs right through this eye socket. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about as I'm making some of these marks here. Thinking about also breaking the curves down into sequence of short, straight marks, rather than trying to get one curve that accounts for the entire skull. And with the vine charcoal, it's relatively light, so it's just going to smudge out really easily. So I want to be really sensitive to that, and knowing that all of these marks are going to disappear at some point. I'm not really ultimately concerned about it. This is, muscle memory plays a big role in drawing. You do it once, and it's easier to do it again. If you do it 3 or 4 times in a drawing, it really starts to lock that in. And so, each time I take a stab at these proportions, I'm anticipating that I'm going to remember it and get a little bit better the next time. So I'm not worried about losing these marks. Being precious with marks can often be destructive. I feel like that's a little too narrow here. So if I have the center line here, looking at this, dividing it up, putting the nose right in here. I need to establish the scale of the nose at some point, but I want to first place it, thinking about this general triangular shape. That crown of the head is right over here. And if that's in the middle, say if I'm happy with this point and this point, I can take that distance carry it across, and I can roughly estimate that the back of the skull is going to end up over here, which feels a little bit better. I can see the drawing in front of me on the screen. That helps to, and it's a smaller scale and it's vertical, so it eliminates some of the distortion I have by looking at this at an angle. So that's also something that I'm looking at. So as you're working, if you're struggling with the proportions, step back from it, and also if you're working on a flat surface, continually tip it up so that you can be aware of any kind of perspective distortion that might occur by the fact that it's at an angle to you. So now I can start to become a little bit more precise. And I want to think about blocking in the major values. You want to be really careful not to get sucked into the detail, especially the teeth. I find as being elements that students really get interested in, and there's a tendency to want to jump into those. Just like when we worked on the portrait, there's a tendency to want to jump right into working with the eyes, and you want to kind of save those for last. Kind of delay that gratification. What can sometimes happen is when you jump right into the things that are most exciting, then we kind of lose steam for the rest of the drawing. And so sometimes I will intentionally hold off until the very end of the things that I'm most excited about, so that there's always a sense of anticipation as I work through the drawing. All right, just trying to think again, basically about blocking in values. And so the teeth, what I'm thinking about is this kind of cylindrical form that the jaw makes as it wraps around. And so there's light that's stronger on this side and it falls into shadow. And this has gotten all smudged, but I'll erase that out in a little bit. And maybe what I need to do is darken this now. Go right up to the edge. And this is such a smooth paper that I think we're going to be able to get some really fine detail. And now I can do some negative drawing. I've got my kneaded eraser here, and I've got some suggestions of the light lines that I laid in earlier, and that'll help to serve as a guide. But I'm still thinking very much in the same way as I did, early on, thinking about the general form first, making sure I get that before I go in and make it more specific. Can think about making sure that the eyebrow, the eye sockets kind of line up along the axis of the brow. And then thinking about the overall proportions. Does the nose feel like it's this kind of cavity here, does it feel like it's the appropriate size? Something that I'm thinking about as well. That's kind of all in shadow there. And the form of the eye socket's really fascinating because there's, it's kind of a combination of square and kind of round. It's got it's rounded, but there's also these kind of distinct sides to it. And so I think it's going to be most helpful to try to see it as a sequence of these straight marks. And then we see this ridge in the eye socket there, and it falls into the shadow. So I'm just kind of taking notes at this point. How's everybody doing? All right, people from all over joining. If you haven't signed in, if you haven't indicated where you're from, if you're new, I'd love to see where you're coming from. These sessions, they go up as recordings afterwards. So if you're if you can't stay for the whole thing, or if you're coming in late, then you know, you'll be able to stick with the instruction. You'll be able to get the full instruction. All right, so I'm feeling like this forehead, it feels a little short to me. And so I want to be careful not to kind of trust those initial marks. I can feel myself wanting to get into those details, but I want to double check my proportions. I can start to suggest this reflection here. And this is really interesting along the jawline. What I find myself doing is I know that this is rounded. It's like this kind of horseshoe shape. It's very rounded. But optically, from my perspective here, it's much more horizontal. You know, we've got a very distinct kind of angle along this section and then a slight downtick here. And then right in here, it's really wrapping around. But we don't have a whole lot of visual information about what's happening around there. So I need to really trust this shape and override what's happening in my mind, which is to draw something that's rounded, because I know it's round. But again, I need to trust kind of what's happening optically here. And that's one of the advantages to relying on these techniques. You know, angle sighting, which is finding an angle in your drawing, in your subject and transferring it to your drawing. There's comparative measuring, so looking at, say, the height of the nose here, comparing it to the eye, or measuring down and comparing it to other portions of the skull. That's called comparative measuring. You can use plumb lines, which are vertical lines that run down from key landmarks, or down or up. And those are all tools that we use. And utilizing those, I think, is really helpful in ingraining in your mind an understanding of the object or the subject that you're working on. Relying on optical devices or grids to transfer, again, will lead to a really positive result. And I encourage you to use those techniques if it works for you. But if you struggle with proportion, I would encourage you to set that aside for one of these drawings and really practice some of these techniques. Like I said, what it's going to help you do is become, it's going to build that internal understanding, that mental image you have of the object. So thinking about this general shadow here, and there's kind of a softer transition in here that I can start to suggest, indicate. And then if I look up here, I want to double check the overall proportions. I feel like this does get a little bit small. I might make that a little bit larger. So what I can do is I can look at the size of the eye socket. So if I take this measurement from the bottom of the eye socket to the top of the eye socket, compare it from the top of the eye socket up to the forehead, and I can look down here, I feel like I'm in pretty good shape. Again, that's called comparative measuring. All right, and we can use some selective focus. I love what's happening along this edge, just as, you know, without really using a line, it's just using value to define that edge. That could be really interesting, and then it allow that edge to kind of fall into that shadow. George 10,000, should I use oil pastels to draw the skull? Sure. It's been a long time since I've used oil pastels. I've used soft pastels more frequently. What a great medium that would be. All right, so what's the best way to shade? So there's, in terms of qualifying it as best or not, it's really a personal choice. I see a lot of great artists that use cross-hatching and very fine line work to build up areas of value. I prefer to use charcoal and create these large areas of that. So this is just vine charcoal that I'm using, and it's so soft that I can kind of smooth that out, and it allows me to create some contrast with areas that have broad expressions of value, and others where it might be, I can kind of contrast that against kind of cross-hatching in other areas. So find what works best for you, and kind of go from there. I think I want to ultimately, before I get too far along, I know that the background is going to influence my understanding of the values in this skull. So I think dropping the value back down in here is going to be helpful. Again, just using the palms to do this. It's starting to build up some nice charcoal there, but I like to use the palm because it's less oily than the fingertips. And especially on a smooth paper like this, sometimes those oils, it can leave a distinct fingerprint on the page, so the charcoal will bind to that a bit more easily. All right, let's see. Yeah. Okay. I think this background is going to be sufficient for now in terms of dropping in that value. And you can see that I'm also using the side of my pinky here to smudge. If I go to a clean finger, say this is all clean here, it's going to lift up more of that charcoal. So I like to, at some point, the fingers become a drawing tool. Now, some of you may feel a little uncomfortable with charcoal. That's very common in my drawing classes that I've taught over the years. Whenever we get to charcoal, I would say about a third of the class has a really hard time with just the material of it, and that's perfectly fine. So try to find the material that works best for you. But if you are kind of struggling with it as a material because it's so messy, give it a shot. Try to push that if you can. I love having the ability to use my fingers to actually draw with to some degree. And remember, one of the things I say all the time is you're always making marks. You're always indicating something. So even when you have the eraser, the eraser isn't just about kind of removing things from the page. You're always contributing to your understanding of the form or the value. So I'll come in later with either the carbon pencil or the charcoal pencil to kind of refine these edges. All right, now let's see. I guess I'll just fill that in right now. Just love how soft that is. All right. Now we can go through and start to kind of correct a bit. How do I want to do this? Let's see. I think I want to start right in here, work my way out, trying to refine some of these edges using the eraser. And I want to see how far that gets me, and if it gets me the sharpness that I need. I'm trying to think a lot about just these as abstract shapes at this point. I kind of like this shape right in here. I kind of erased out too much of it. And come back in and correct the shape of the eye socket here. There's this kind of concave quality to it as it wraps around and then back up and then down over into the eye socket. And then this is just a charcoal pencil, keeping the lines very light, but I want to be able to define now a precise edge. Now this eye socket is very subtle, so I'm looking at these curves here and how they relate to one another. So rather than drawing a line, I'm trying to think about it as a shape. So try to visualize the path in my mind, and then as I make my marks here, trying to bring them up to that path that now I have in my mind, rather than drawing a line to indicate that path first. I think that's going to really add to the realism here. Trying to get rid of the outlines as much as possible. And I can come back in and correct with the eraser, not correct, but like refine that edge. Now I'm going to use some shading stumps in here, so if you do need a little bit more precision, bringing in a shading stump, this one's already kind of loaded with charcoal because I've been using it a lot lately. And I notice there's also, there's kind of a shift in value. It's a little bit darker down on this edge. And I'm going to kind of work up. This is a bit thinner in the reference, so I can cut in this way. See how that works. All right, I'm going to utilize, let's see, I'm going to look at the screen to make sure everything's looking good. If this could kind of come up a little bit, there's kind of this rounded quality that I think I've squared out too much. I can round that out. Now I can come back in here. Again, now because this is kind of loaded with charcoal, I can use that to draw. I can come in some of these broad areas, pick up more charcoal here, and then use that as a drawing tool. And it keeps these marks light, and I kind of sneak up on the values that way. Sometimes that charcoal can be a little bit too intense. Jason, you have a number 2 pencil. Yeah, go for it if you can. Maybe try to actually shave off, if you have a razor blade, shave off a bit of the wood casing around it, just like I did here with this charcoal pencil. Try to expose a bit more of the pencil, and that allows you to get on its side, and you'll be able to cover a broad area with that, and you'll achieve a softer control over your values. If it's too sharp of a point and you're working with it like this, it's going to kind of emboss on the page, and it'll leave more permanent marks. To create softer marks, again, kind of try to expose more of the graphite by just using a razor blade, and then work with it on its side. So I'm trying to think through this a little bit. So utilizing some of you're just using the shading stump as a way to create some subtle marks that I can adjust later. I think I'm gonna sneak up on the values here. And I love the play of light in this eye socket here, where we go from, there's a kind of this thin sliver of light in here, into shadow, into light, a highlight here, then back into shadow, and then along this eye socket, this ridge in the eye socket, we go from shadow into light. And it's just this beautiful transition between light and shadow. It's one of the things I like to think about when I'm setting up a still life. And so I took some time really trying to think through the reference photo before working on this. I mean, I took quite a few shots, and what I'm looking for is, is the information. Do I have enough visual information about the object that's going to serve me in the drawing? So working at it at a 3/4 angle gives me some depth information about the skull. If I had rotated it directly on, I kind of lose that. Actually, I got the skull back here. My mic here. You can kind of see that here. I don't know if it's a little bit out of focus, but if I view it this way, I lose all of the side information. Turning it to the left or the right, going 3/4, now I have a lot more information to work with. And then looking at the alternating sequence between light and dark, it's going to help me to develop that in the drawing. That's what I'm thinking about. If this was blasted with light with few shadows, then I'd be in trouble because everything would just be kind of white. I need those shadows. And often what works for photography itself doesn't necessarily work for drawing or painting. Like I'll see students a lot want to work from magazines and perhaps do a portrait from a magazine. But what's challenging about that is that those models are often so lit so heavily, we don't get strong contrast between light and dark, that in the drawing everything just looks flat. It's a beautiful image when it's in a photograph and you get these nice understanding of the color in the subject. But when working in charcoal, and particularly if you're drawing, you want to amplify that contrast between light and dark. So all right, so we can really start to see this forming, and almost really kind of like this soft atmospheric effect that we've got going on. All right, green guys, kind of depressed. I get that. Certainly, the power of art to me is the ability to really immerse yourself in another world. Some people say it's an escape, but I think actually it's the opposite. It's about being incredibly present, and what that does for the mind is really valuable. So for me, anything you can do to start making marks, to observe your world, kind of fall into the process of art making, the better. And what I love, one of the things we've talked about in this series as well is there's a difference between the drawing and drawing. And some students, ask me, why do I not work from, say, a black and white photograph? It would make it easier in the drawing, right? Because I am just able to translate the value of a color, value to value from a black and white photograph into a black and white drawing. My answer to that is, by doing that, I'm prioritizing the drawing itself. It's about saying I want to come out of this experience having this drawing. For me, it's just not as important. The act of drawing is ultimately what I want to do. I like drawing, not necessarily the drawing. And again, that's just kind of my take on it. But it's something that you might consider, because sometimes we put so much kind of emphasis on the product itself that we lose any kind of sense that the action of drawing is tremendously gratifying. It's like people go out to the club to go dancing, not so that they've got this kind of refined, finished, choreographed experience. They go out because you just love that feeling. And drawing is an action as well as it's a verb as well as a noun. Starting to kind of refine some of these shapes. I'm in this shadow area, so now I'm trying to break that shadow area down into multiple parts. So as I'm looking at, say, this socket here, what I'm doing here is kind of triangulating. I'm angle sighting. I'm looking at this angle and asking myself, does that correlate? Get good at working in your periphery. So as I'm looking at this, I'm aware of the action of my pencil and whether or not it is aligning with the paths that I'm seeing in the reference photo. And then moving back and forth very quickly with my eyes, I can start to see where things are off. If they are. So I want to use this landmark here. Does that line up? Yes, directly above there. And going to come across here. Kind of placing this landmark, that back edge of the jaw. Now we got this turn here, and I want to visualize where that is in the relationship to the rest of the skull. So if I come up right, cuts right through this section of the jaw and right up through the eye socket. So if I take that, yeah, that feels pretty good. All right. Krisha saying, I love the drawing. I'm just wondering, should the left cheekbone be a little smaller or more leveled with the nose? Yes, it should. So this is too great. So the thing is, I'm not quite confident in the shape of that nose. So I'm kind of waiting to do that, but I think that's a good observation there. Looking at this point here, this all feels good. And so what I want to do is I want to maybe refine this nose. I can do some angle sighting. So if I take the left corner of the eye socket with the left corner of the nose cavity, I can see that ultimately what needs to happen is that this needs to come down more. And that might correct it, and it may be a combination of both, so then I may have to raise that cheekbone up as well. That's a good observation. Feel free to shout out if you notice anything off with those proportions. That was a huge help. Yeah, on Wednesday, working on my self-portrait, holy smokes. that was brutal. Really hard, but I found it really helpful to have you all kind of assist with those proportions. And I've seen several of you have kind of tagged me in drawings that were posted on, say, on Instagram, and it's been really incredible to see some of the results there. So now, Krisha, I think you're right. So then this still needs to come back up. So I'm feeling more confident about the shape of this nose cavity, but this is still now below that. And if we look across, if we take this horizontal measurement across here, that brings this up. And we can make some of those adjustments there. I can angle sight too. I can look at this, if I connect the two cheekbones, does that make sense? Pretty close. This might need to come down a little bit. I'll make some adjustments to that as we get through it. Looking for that general shape. There's this really cool kind of transition in light and dark in here, where we see this thin sliver of light along the left side jawbone, and we see it fall into shadow. So what you can do here is, if that's something that you want to indicate, I have this eraser that I've shaved down to this point. It's kind of worn down a little bit, but it helps me to get a sharper edge. And you see what that does there to that. So rather than drawing that line, I've kind of erased out that highlight along the ridge. Let's see how that works. All right, whew, gotta take a stretch here. I like that. Low, infinite possibilities. Yes, I think you're definitely right. I thought I saw a kind of question, so I'm just gonna scroll up here. All right, good feedback, everybody. I'm missing some stuff here. Sherry, are your classes and tutorials beginner-oriented? Potentially, yeah. I mean, I like to think of these as kind of beginning drawing classes. I try not to distinguish necessarily between advanced and kind of beginning drawing. So if you are a real beginner and I'm missing something that could be helpful to you, or if I'm doing something and you really just have a question about what I'm doing, feel free to shout out. You know, what I've learned over the years drawing is that it's about falling into the fundamentals of the process rather than really mastering them or kind of getting beyond them. You never really get beyond the stuff that you learn as a beginner. You just understand it at a deeper level, if that makes sense. So that's one of the reasons why I try not to distinguish too much between beginner, intermediate, and advanced. You might just, as a more experienced drawer, you might be more familiar with some of the terms. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you are a real beginner and you just have some fundamental questions, go ahead and ask them, because I feel like they could still be valuable to people who may be even more experienced. So I'm thinking about kind of breaking this value down a little bit. I've got this kind of wedge of light. I need to adjust this form a little bit. So I'm kind of over-exaggerating, I'm kind of over-cutting that light that's catching on the inside of the jaw back there. And then what might ultimately be helpful is to kind of shade this in a little bit, doing some negative drawing, difference between positive and negative space, so that anything that we refer to positive space as the thing that is the object, negative space is the space around the object. So what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about the shape of the jaw, but I'm creating that shape by drawing the space around it, not the jaw itself, if that makes sense. So thinking about this cast shadow here. This is going to be really helpful actually. As I lay this in, I'll be able to pick up some charcoal with my shading stump. I'm going to refine the shape of that shadow later on. I mostly just need it for that negative space in here to refine the shape of the skull. So I'm going to run these marks horizontally to contrast against kind of the more vertical shape of the skull at this point. That'll help to create some depth there. So if you're going for realism, try to get rid of the line work as much as possible. Lines don't exist in nature. They are abstract constructs that we develop to help represent an edge. And so by getting rid of the line to define the edge and just using values like I have here, then that'll hopefully add to the overall realism. So just kind of bringing some value in here. I'm going to have to darken that a little bit later. I'm not going to go any farther with the teeth at this point. I could feel myself wanting to get sucked into that. I'm going to hold that off. That's going to be the most fun part of this whole process. So maybe what I need to do is look at the overall values, see how I'm doing with that. I kind of like this alternating sequence between dark background, light skull, transitioning into dark skull in the shadow against a lighter background. So even though this is darker than the highlights, but is lighter than the shadow. So I really like that overall sequence. So I'm going to kind of block in this a little bit more, maybe exaggerate that some. I have that line, but I want to get rid of that line. So as I'm shading, I'm thinking about bringing up values that consume that outline as much as possible. And if I need to refine that edge, check this out. So I can bring my eraser in here. I follow along the line that I want. And then just kind of lightly smudge it out. And it leaves a kind of a sharper edge there. I don't want the halo to be too strong. And as we soften that edge, it's going to create more atmosphere and depth. So one of the things that we also see, you want to pay attention to are the value relationships as you follow up along an edge, and try to vary that as much as possible. So you want to think about, as you follow along an edge, is there a change in relationship between the background and the object frequently? And then in here, it gets a little bit darker as we wrap around the skull here. There's some reflected light in here. It's a little bit lighter as we transition. So as we get to the top of the skull, that edge almost disappears. And let that happen. That's called a lost and found edge. That adds to the realism overall. It creates a sense of atmosphere. Thinking about the cross contour as well. So if you're new, then you want to think about the two terms, cross contour and contour. A contour line is a line that we use to indicate a three-dimensional object. So as I'm drawing, say, a line around here, that's a contour line. The cross contour are marks that you make within that to help reference the form and reinforce that. And so being aware of that can be really helpful in creating a sense of depth and space in your drawing, because you can run your marks following the contour of the object, and it creates a better kind of understanding of the three-dimensional form. So I can make the form feel more three-dimensional by wrapping my marks kind of around there. So thinking about some of these shadow shapes in here, really trying to observe what happens in this transition from the jaw into the cheekbone. Maybe smudge this out. And you can see now that by darkening this, it creates a little kind of subtle sense of bounce light in here, and it gets a little bit darker here. If I need to exaggerate that a little bit more, I can use my kneaded eraser, kind of pull out some of that value, refine it. And then we can see there's a little bit of light bouncing off of the surface, striking this, that I can start to indicate. So I'm trying to be very gentle with the shapes here. And I think I underestimated the size of this portion here. So I want to get back in, and I think what I did is I kind of undercut too much. There's this lobe right here there. Smooth that out. Let me see what happens if I sharpen this a little bit more. All right, how we feel about that. All right. Let's see. All right, thank you all for joining me. Where are we at? We're about 45 minutes in. I'd say we're about halfway done, perhaps more. We'll see. The one on Wednesday took over 2 hours. That's kind of a record for this series, is to go that long. I don't think this is going to take quite that long, but I want to kind of erase out some of that texture there. So building up, I've got enough charcoal on my fingers that I can kind of smudge this out, and I can start to look for the light. I love this little seam in the forehead from the skull. And what I like about it is that it helps to understand that three-dimensional form. So what I'm doing now, let's see, I feel like I kind of made that too big. Just trying to visualize that. Maybe what I need to do ultimately is use this edge. Pulling out a little bit of a highlight there. And then I can use my shading stump to kind of thin that out. Kind of indicate that path. what's going on right here. It's really catching. There's a little bit of a, must be a little flaw on the paper or something. That, I could just pick that out with my eraser. Does it come back? I don't know what that was. All right. Pulling out some of the highlights here. Trying to think about really wrapping around the three-dimensional form of the skull. And then, let me see, I can indicate this seam. Something like that. So if we keep it subtle, it helps to see that three-dimensional form. And then we're gonna bring in a highlight right in here, not right up to the edge, but just in from it. That will help to create a kind of a three-dimensional turn in the forehead here. Now I can see a distinct highlight right there on that brow. So what that tells me is I need to actually come down in value just a touch. Might be too much. And erase that down. That's too heavy. So I think I need to use this one. Again, that's too heavy. So I can use my shading stump to kind of refine that, coming right up to that edge a bit more. I don't like that. I'm going to soften this with some pressure on the kneaded eraser. Just really light pressure. All right. I'm going to shade this a little bit more. Darken it towards the bottom. Need to do, I'm going to pop that nose forward a little bit more. So I'm going to shade, bring this down in value just a little bit, darken it along in here, and then catch a little light right up here. So I've kind of overcut that light. And now I can come back in and refine the shape of the nose. Hopefully that pops that forward out, pops that out a little bit more. Okay. And now really pay attention to the alternating sequence of light and dark. So we get this, again, this thin sliver of light catching on the inside of the nose cavity here. And that's overstated. I've got it too much. That's all right. It's helping me to see that form. And now I'm going to come back and refine that down a little bit. So I'm going to sneak up on this edge here by darkening in the shadow and leaving that thin sliver, right? Trace out that line and build the values up to it, just leaving that fine sliver of light showing through. So now I'm just drawing with the shading stump, looking at these general shapes here. I see what happens here. I love this. Right in here where the tear duct is, there's this kind of triangular form. And again, I'm going to do the same technique. I'm going to kind of refine that. I made it too big because my eraser is pretty chunky. Now I'm going to come back in and refine that down a little bit. I'll let that trail out, and then we transition into shadow on this side of the eye socket. All right, how's everybody doing? Feeling good so far? Let me kind of scroll down. I'm missing some comments here. Gray gradient should be extended. Use the eraser. The use of eraser limits it. Potentially, I think I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure I'm following, but if you want to expand on that comment, let me know. I've seen a lot of comments come through, so I may be missing some questions that you have. So I'll do my best to try to address them if I can. But I think what I need to do is, what I'm looking for now in here are some of the planes. You know, it's a really complex form right in here. Is it? You know, there's this general kind of wraparound on the cheekbone, but it gets broken into these distinct planes that are visually interesting. So I'm going to refine this shape along in here. And kind of, I've overcut that. That's all right. Now I can come in and refine that a little bit more. So here we get, again, pay attention to the alternating sequence between light and dark. So we have light, we have dark around it, and so we go from light into here into the shadow, and that's ultimately what defines the cheekbone here as that becomes light against the darker shadow. Refining that a little bit. Now I can, this is a bit strong. I'm going to kind of smooth that out a little bit to create that transition down in there. And then darken right in under here. I'm going to use my eraser to kind of refine that form a little bit. There's a slight rounded quality to the bone in here, so I'm not worried about it being a super sharp edge. There's some texture in there, so I can leave that fairly rough. I think that's going to help serve me in the end in terms of creating that. Before I get too far in here, though, I haven't really gotten into this eye socket, so let me get back into that now. Looking at kind of the subtle shifts in value as we transition into here, there's a distinct shadow that gets cast across here. So I want to look for that shape. I can darken that up a little bit. And then it's a little bit smoother of a transition here. So we go into the light here, but I want there to be a kind of a highlight right in along in here. So I can add a little bit of value. And then it gets even darker in this section. So I really want to look at the shape of the bone. Lay in some of these values. They're a little dark right now, but I can lift those off. And I keep this small. I think I started to overstate that. And that's what helps to qualify the depth of that shadow, is adding that dark area right in here. And then it gets there's a bit of a transition under here. So I need to think about how much I want to state those. If I make it too harsh, I worry about it kind of popping forward and degrading that form a little bit, making it hard to see that form. But now I'm looking for some subtle shifts in value. I think I'm exaggerating this a bit too much in this eye socket. Let me see how that looks on camera, though. I feel like maybe that works out all right. It's a little bit darker than what we're seeing in the reference photo, but I'm going to leave it for now and maybe come back to it later because perhaps it's working for me. All right. Yes, more shades of gray allow for a more real model. Exactly, yeah. Oh, Jassix, the holes here, those are from the nerves, huh? That I had no idea. that is a fascinating thing. I can drop those in, kind of smoothing that transition. This one here is a little less visible. All right. All right, some people are cutting out, so thank you. If you've been watching and you need to take off, I'm going to come back here in the nose here and refine this out so we have kind of darker, kind of a darker kind of form right in here that forms these ridges in the nasal cavity. So I'm laying down charcoal. It's really kind of too much, too dark. I can lift that off with a kneaded eraser if I need to, but I'm going to try smudging it, thinking about refining this form as we go. And so what's kind of significant about here in the nasal cavity is the contrast between kind of sharper edges and a kind of softer gradients. And so, you know, we see the sharp ridge along in here, and then there's a kind of a softer gradient moving up this part of the nasal cavity. So I want to go in and sharpen this up a little bit more. Not all the way up, but just tapping it along some portions of it to help kind of sharpen this edge. If I overstate that, it's going to flatten it out. So I just need to bring in a touch of line work to sharpen up that form. And again, I feel like I've exaggerated the values here, but I'm going to leave them for now. See how it holds up. All right, let's see. Refine this shape a little bit more. There's this seam right down here in the middle. Using my shading stump helps to indicate that rather than using my charcoal. Now I can start to think about the general shape of the mouth as we get into that. And so there's a little bit of shadow right on the upper part of that, and then it turns and it gets light under here, and then we see the teeth underneath that. And I'm going to work my way from the outside in on the teeth, I think, is what I'm going to do. So I'm trying to see through this overall shift in value. And then I'm going to make that a bit more specific. So this starts to get really complex in terms of the form. I need to make this smaller. I think I've overstated that. This is off. Just a touch. I think I need to bring that in because it's not giving me enough room to get those molars in. So I'm kind of cutting that back with the highlight, catching on that jaw. And now I can refine that, doing some negative drawing. Visualize the path. If I draw a line there, I want that to be consumed by the shading so it doesn't read as a line. That feels a little bit better overall, a bit more delicate. And I can darken this side a little bit more. There's some bounce light happening in there. So I can darken in on here just a little bit. So it's not super consistent here. Get a shadow. Do I ever use white charcoal? I do, yeah, I use a white chalk every now and then. That's what Mildred is asking. I am not going to use it for this one, but if you look back in some of the other videos in the series, I've used a combination of charcoal and white chalk. And that can be helpful. What I wanted to try to avoid in this one is use of that because of the change in temperature. There's so much white here. As I bring it in, that white chalk or a white charcoal can be a different temperature, be warmer or cooler than the charcoal. Let's see, I'm going to come into that a little bit later. What do I need to do here? I want to be really careful about overstating the teeth. So one of the tendencies that I've seen students in the past do is they get in there and they want to do a line for every tooth that's in there. Instead, what I want to be doing is trying to think about the general shape, and I need to ask myself, how critical is it that I get every tooth in there exactly as it's seen? Or can I just suggest them? And I think for the purposes of time here, I am going to just simply suggest the teeth more. And so hopefully that will make sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a little bit more charcoal on my shading stump and use that to draw. And I'm going to work my way up into it. So I'm going to start to think through these shadow shapes here from along the lower jaw, from those lower teeth. Trying to be aware of that central line. I think I need to darken this a little bit in here. I'll refine this down a little bit. Start to indicate those back molars. Try to think abstractly about them as much as possible. And before I make the mark, I'm trying to gauge where am I in relationship to the drawing. And I don't know the specific names of each of these teeth. I'm just trying to kind of suggest light and shadow as much as possible. I'm going to come across here. This is a nice little landmark here, that central line, so I can see what tooth lines with that. And I'm trying to indicate the rough shadow shapes. There's lawnmowers going on out on that side there, so hopefully it's not impacting the audio too much. They've been at this all day. It's crazy. They're really working. I didn't realize we had this many areas to work on in the apartment complex I'm in right now. Unfortunately, I can't do much about that, which is kind of frustrating. But all right, so you can see that I'm starting to indicate just the shadow shapes there. And now I'm going to come back in and I'm going to think about the light. And now what you want to be careful with, though, is that when we get into that shadow side, we see a contrast between light and darken here, but those highlights aren't nearly as light as the highlights over here. So I want to maintain that hierarchy in terms of value. I might need to actually darken this just a touch to amplify the contrast a little bit here. And there's a little bit of light kind of catching here on the teeth. Let me see if I smooth that out. Now if I erase out any highlights, they should show up. Trying to think through these general shapes, these kind of triangular forms. And I'm off on the proportions on them, but I'm telling myself that's all right. As long as I get that curve around there, I'm going to trust that viewers aren't necessarily counting every tooth in there. And now there are these little specks where we see this little bit of dark, and that does a lot in terms of defining the shape. But I want to be really careful with them and not overstate things. So looking at it in terms of the light and shadow that I've established, trying to keep somewhat organized with my thoughts. And just kind of tapping along. I'm not drawing a line, I'm just creating kind of a visual path through the mouth by kind of tapping along. And there are some areas where those teeth, the values really kind of blend together, and I'm going to let that happen. And now kind of refine this a little bit more. So if I miss a tooth or if it's a little bit off, I think we're going to find that it's still creating a convincing impression of what we're going for. So if I had, infinite time, I might go in there and really kind of refine that down. But to me, honestly, I don't know if I would want to do that. Let's see. I don't generally like being too particular with my artwork. I start to feel claustrophobic when I get in there and try to get all these details in, and it kind of pulls me out of the drawing experience, and I start focusing on the drawing itself too much. Just allowing myself to suggest forms. Some of the proportions are off a little bit, I'm noticing, but hopefully it's convincing enough that a viewer can look at this and say, hey, no, that looks like a skull. Each skull would be different. And there's this the hole there. Drawing a little mark there, and then it catches light right in the inside of that. That's really cool. So kind of exaggerating that and now bringing in some value to kind of cut that back out. So then that little dot has a shadow and a light side. Smooth that out here, and you can refine this a bit. Kind of just shaded right in here, so that because that line was a little too sharp right up to the edge, I lost that form. And then I can shape this out. You get in there and just try to get that background washed in, get some of that shadow. I want to deal with that reflection a little bit. This is a really interesting form. Kind of observe that general shape. So I'll pick up the vine charcoal. Thinking through the shape that I'm seeing in that reflection. I like how it gets, there's kind of this vignetting happening where it gets a little bit darker around the edges. So I can amplify that a little bit with a vine charcoal. So I'm just laying it down and then smudging it out. With the soft vine charcoal, it's not leaving these intense marks, which is kind of nice. But it does create a little bit of value in here. I didn't end up actually utilizing the carbon pencil today. Kind of forgot all about that thing. All right. Build up more value here. Got rid of that reflection, But watch, let's see if I can bring that back. Not by erasing it out, but I think I want to build up value around it. So here we go. I'm just going to do some negative drawing, refining that lower jaw by drawing the shape around it. And there are sections here where that shadow gets really thin. Drawing these shadow shapes here, the cast shadows. If you've been following along the series, you'll have heard the terms form shadow and cast shadow, as well as shadow shape. So a form shadow is the shadow that is on the form of the object. So that's this shadow here on the skull. Now the cast shadow is, of course, the shadow that's cast by the object. And then there's the shadow shape. There's kind of a blending of those two together. So I'm trying to hold in my mind an awareness of that shadow shape to see if they all hold together. So when I squint my eyes, they should kind of blend, and I think that's happening pretty well here. Kind of suggesting that shadow. I'm not being very specific with it. Looking here at kind of suggesting the darks and lights in here in the skull that I'm seeing kind of lightly reflected on the surface here. And if I darken this and around in here, trying to be aware of this path, but not drawing a line, just keeping it a very soft atmospheric shape. Lay in some charcoal. So I don't want that reflection to be strong. I want to be really careful along in here. I don't want there to be a halo. So if anything, I need to sacrifice that sharp highlight and reestablish it. I want to avoid that halo. So if I need it to, I can go right over the edge. Maybe trail that off a little bit, so I don't want a solid gray background here. I want there to be some variation. So I sacrifice that edge, going right up over it, and then I can cut that back out with the eraser. And have that back again. And that creates a stronger contrast between light and shadow. All right, so how's everybody doing? I think we're pretty close to the end here. How far we're about an hour and 20 minutes in, so not too bad. About an hour and a half is what I was thinking. I come here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern. Next week, we're going to be drawing hair. Got a beautiful subject that sat for me. And I'm really looking forward to that drawing. Or also, I've got a cat that I'm drawing on Wednesday. Just about the fluffiest cat I've ever seen. And so we're going to kind of practice fur there. And then on Friday, eggshells and an egg. So next week is really about texture. We've been focusing a lot on light and shadow here. But I hope to see you all on those as well, those drawings as well. Like I said, I've enjoyed seeing people share your drawings with me. And we're working at that at artistnetwork.com. If you want more information and more resources on drawing, go to artistnetwork.com. There's a link in the description. And I have a page there that features additional resources, and we're working on some additional tools as well. As our community here grows, I'm really hoping that we can start to share the work that we're doing with one another. So if there's any questions, I am going to kind of go back through, but this is really it. I'm going to look back through the chats here to see if anything comes up, if there are any questions that I missed. Again, this goes up as a recording on Artist Network. On the Artist Network YouTube page, so you can always revisit it if you'd like. It's been a blast working on this, so I really appreciate you all taking the time. This is all about just utilizing our time at home to strengthen our skills. And I found already, I really feel the impact of doing all of this practice. I feel like I'm getting better, and that's exactly why we're here doing this. Is drawing is one of the things that I often neglect to really practice, and I think it's going to really help my painting practice by spending more time, drawing here. So that's why we're here, because we believe drawing is awesome. It's a really helpful skill to develop. So thank you all for joining me. Mildred is asking, pencil? No, this ended up being charcoal. I did have a carbon pencil with me that I was planning on using, but I just got kind of sucked into it. I have done some graphite drawings in the series, and I've kind of struggled with how light they show up on camera, so I've been kind of focusing on charcoal and kind of reverting to that. But a lot of these ideas you can replicate in graphite. So if you're working in pencil, then hopefully you'll be able to work on those as well. Marlene, I'm glad you're getting better. That's awesome. Thank you. Matthew, love drawing. Excellent. I should draw Tybalt. That's exactly who I should draw. Britton, I think that's a fantastic idea. You're welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm going to go back through, see if there's any questions that have been asked that I didn't answer. Cynthia's asking if this is the final drawing together lesson. Nope. Well, we're still doing this. This has been so much fun for me, so we're just going to keep doing this as long as we can. So keep looking. Check out the Artist Network page. We've got more information about what's upcoming. Cynthia, yes, it is a complicated. So, can a stump be sharpened? That is a wonderful question, Arlene. I don't know if you do have a shading stump. You can see I actually have two here. This one I've been using a lot more, and what ended up happening is you can see how it pushes in. That's the trouble that I have, and so I try to push that back out. This one has retained its point, so I kind of use them interchangeably. So I'll just take like a sharp tool, like a toothpick or something, and poke that point back out, but it's never going to be as sharp as this. They're so cheap that I don't know if you can actually sharpen them or if it's worth it versus just getting a new one. But I'm finding that, I never used to draw with these things, but I am rapidly falling in love with them. So give it a shot. Flyaway is asking about the stump. Yeah, these are, God, I guess I've seen them referred to as tortillions. So you might find those, and you can generally get them in packs or individuals. So give those a shot. I don't really know enough about various manufacturers of them, unfortunately, but to see if there's a significant difference. UV's movies. I'm a new artist, 12 years old. Any tips or suggestions? Yes, draw. Just draw. And the thing about it is, what I love about drawing is you can just do it all by yourself. That's how I got started. Is I had a room that had a big old chalkboard that I used to just sit and draw on that chalkboard all the time, and you just wipe it out. And you just keep drawing. And once you start to become precious with your drawings, you can start to throw things off, especially if you're getting started. So just draw. Don't worry about making good drawings. Just think about, Are you having fun drawing? Is it a fun experience? Are you learning from it? And at the end, you look at it and say, what could be improved and what am I doing well? So you can apply that to your next drawing. You want to be aware of what you're doing well. Often I've noticed that many artists can be so critical about what they've done wrong that they forget all the good things that they've done in it. And so think about what could be improved so that you can improve on that the next time, but also be aware of what you're doing well, because if you're conscious about it, you'll replicate it more easily in the next one. And the next thing you know is you've got this really healthy habit of drawing, and you've developed a really solid muscle memory. So for example here, I'm feeling confident about the value control. I like that. What I feel like I am off a bit in some of the proportions. Maybe amplify some of the values in this area here. I don't know. Well, but some of the edges I think are working out well. Some could be more refined, but overall I'm happy with it. All right. Thank you everybody for joining me. Not seeing any additional questions. Please teach flower drawing sometime soon. Shireen, there is a rose drawing that I did. Did I do that Monday? I think I did that Monday. So go back and check that out. I'll probably be doing another flower at some point as well. So thank you so much. Proportions, I need to work on that, Mark says. Yes, yeah, it's good to be aware of all those things. All right, everybody, thank you so much. I'm going to sign off. I will see you all on Monday. Have a great weekend.